do this on a stage, and I'll say, creation's down there, 2013's down there, and I'm going to have a snippet of just 25 years of the, this timeline of humanity and events. And usually, not going to do it here because we've done it all week, but usually I'll start and I'll say there's two ways to get the resurrection data. One is to do it as a reliability argument. And I'll say, have you ever thought about what's the basis for Alexander? And people just assume we know about Alexander, but people put down the Gospels, and I'll go down my thing here and I'll say, I'm going to use critical dating, and Mark, critics now, not that much different than evangelical dating. Mark's about 70, Matthew's about 80, Luke's about 85. Everybody puts John about 95. If the cross is 30, say if, because some people put it 33. If the cross is 30, this is just plus 65. That's all it is. But a lot of critics like to say plus 65 is way too late. So I'll contrast this with Alexander. If I'm at a big church with a long stage, I'll say, now, I come down here, and I don't use PowerPoint. I call them I'm a walking PowerPoint in this lecture. So, all right, here's Alexander's death, about 330 BC. And an earliest source for Alexander, while I'm talking, I keep walking, and in this big church, I keep going, and I might go out 50 more feet. And then there's almost always a door there on that side of the sanctuary. And so I open the door like I'm going to go outside into the parking lot. I don't let the door slam because then someone's got to let me back in. But I tell them, I'll say, it's off the screen. If this is 65 years, the earliest source for Alexander is 300, best sources are 450, because I want them to get an idea. So I do the reliability argument, and I say the reliability argument works with the Gospels. But from this point on, I'm going to do a whole different argument for you. I really briefly introduce a minimal facts argument to them. That I'm going to use only data which are multiply attested, the brick with the arrows. I don't do the brick wall and all that. I just say I'm going to use only facts for which there's multiple data, and critics almost unanimously concede these facts. So from now on, you can believe the Bible is, you can believe the New Testament is unreliable, and you can still get this argument. So this is kind of what I'm assuming in your paper. You don't have to do the minimal facts argument with me, but I'm going to assume the minimal facts argument for the rest of this. So this is I do that one. This is from this point on is the lecture proper. Okay. So this is death. I'm going to say 30 AD because it's both the most popular year and it's a nice round figure. But you realize if it's 33, you're just going to have to adjust my years a little bit. Most of the time, all it does is shove it down, but the plus minus is the same. And instead of using the Gospels, I'm going to use a different argument that most people in the pews, they're not used to this argument. But I'm going to use the Apostle Paul. And the reason I'm going to use the Apostle Paul is because Paul is the critic's darling. Now, we haven't said this before here. Let me take a brief break. I'll just tell them right on the spot. But you folks know that of the 13 epistles that bear Paul's name, critics will unanimously give you, even the infidel group, will unanimously give you 6 to 7 of the Pauline epistles. They'll let you use them. Not as inspired, but as authoritative. What's authoritative mean? Well, Paul's a good thinker. He's the right man at the right position. He was the best position to know this. We don't know the author of the Gospels. This is the critics talking. We don't know the author of the Gospels, but we know the author of these 7 books. Paul makes mistakes. Definitely not saying the books are inerrant. The critic again. But Paul believed everything he said. He's not lying. And that's what authoritative means. I'll accept anything in these books at face value if there's not some reason I should reject them. And they'll always give you the books that you will probably most want. They'll give you Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and for whatever Philemon's worth. I mean, whatever it's worth. It doesn't help us in this argument. a one chapter non-historical argument. So for this lecture, I'll tell the group 13 books bear Paul's name. Critics are going to give you 6 to 7. Even G.A. Wells, who thinks Jesus never lived, will give you these 6 plus Colossians. I'm sorry, these 7 plus Colossians. He'll give you 8 out of 13. Didn't think Jesus lived. And I'll tell the group I'm only going to use 2 texts, and they're both accepted by every critic except Bob Press.
What was that guy's name again? G.A. Wells?
G.A. Wells is the German professor, University of London, who's the modern father of the Jesus never lived movement.
Corinthians and Galatians.
Pardon?
I said Corinthians and Galatians.
He won't. He argues in his latest manuscript Paul doesn't even live, so he won't. Which has not been published. So
He gives you Colossians, though. That's surprising. He said he gives Colossians.
Bob does it. G.A. Wells does.
That's surprising.
Yeah. The other one is the very end of Galatians 1, 1:18 to 2:10, and you know in the originals that's one text. There's no chapter dividing there. So those are the 2 texts, unanimously conceded by critics. I tell them that up front. All right. Ground zero, 30 AD. I'm going to start with the writing of 1 Corinthians. And it doesn't matter, dates differ a little bit whether you're a liberal or conservative or whatever. But the dates don't differ because you're liberal or conservative. They're just, everybody's about 55 AD. So I could stop here and I could say, this is only 25 years from the cross. And in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul gives the gospel. So, any questions? I may never do that, but I tell them I could stop here because it's only 25 years. So this meets criteria for early eyewitness criteria. But I'm going to move with you today all the way back to the cross. All the way back to the cross. So, Paul says 1 Corinthians, and when I go to a state university, I hold the Bible up. I spend time, the first 2 verses gives the gospel. So I give it. I spend time in the gospel. I tell people what they must do to be saved, and I don't think they think I'm like pressuring them because I'm talking about the 2 passages I saw. The one that simply starts the gospel. So I'm just explicating the argument that I said I would give. You know what I mean? Giving the gospel just flows naturally into this lecture. So Paul says, when I came to you in Corinth, I gave you the gospel. And if you responded properly, if you believed, you're saved. And if not, you're not. That's 1 Corinthians 15, 1 and 2. And I stop and I'll say, now, just in case any of you wonder, what is this gospel data? And I'll say, whatever's defined in the New Testament, it's at least these 3 facts. Deity, death, resurrection of Jesus. So that's at least what Paul presented. And then in verse 3, I tell a little bit about creeds, just very briefly. And I'll say, Paul said, I gave you what I was given. And that's passing on tradition. And good teachers pass on tradition. Good teachers repeat. Good teachers tell you what others have taught and what they believe and what the basis for this is. That's how Paul starts. And I'll say, by the way, Josephus tells us that that's how Pharisees taught. By passing on tradition and by building on tradition. I said, bingo. Paul tells us he's a Pharisee. Philippians chapter 3 is one of those well-received passages. That's not going to be one I'm going to use. But so Paul is doing what he's taught. That's why people think he's authoritative. He's doing the teaching research process for us. I gave you what I was given. So by this time, I've slowed down a little bit. And I'll say there's 2 sides to the gospel. Deity, death, resurrection. And Paul says, did you believe? So there's our response to it. I'll talk a little bit about believe. Because believe is a strong word. Pistuo, pistis, the noun. And it means to commit or to surrender or to walk a mile in somebody's shoes, to commit, to rely upon. And I'll go on and say that the closest thing that we have in our culture, to me, that explains this sense of believe in the New Testament is when you say I do to somebody in marriage. Because marriage is for better or worse, rich or poor, till death do we part. the words I do are not complicated, but the kind of commitment it calls for is complicated. And so, yes, the New Testament word is believe, but you have to ask what these guys mean by believe. And when they say pistuo ace, believe in, you can use any kind of word study book. Pistuo ace deepens the commitment level. To believe in is even deeper. And sometimes this is pistuo ace, believe in the name of. And the name stands for the essence of the person in that culture. And to believe in the name of means to really say, I do. And then I'll just say, the major difference is marriage is till death do we part. That's when things just get going well for Christians. That's when the good news starts. So I'll make that analogy because I want them to understand what this commitment is. I'm not saying, I don't want them to walk away and say, I believe George Washington, first president of the United States, and I believe Jesus died on the cross and was raised again. So I do the gospel right there, and then the argument. All right, so Paul's writing 1 Corinthians at about 55 AD, plus 25. But Paul says, first two verses, this is the gospel I preached when I came to you. Oh, so it was earlier than this. Yeah. What's this date? The date he wrote the book. But when did he come to Corinth? Some New Testament scholars think this is the most easily ascertainable date in the New Testament. Paul comes to Corinth 51 to 52 AD. And we know because we're told who's the, what's his title?
Governor or something.
Governor. It's not really governor, but it's something of the city.
Governor.
Of the city, and they say who the guy is when he comes. Well, here's the interesting thing. We have a stone inscription of his name, and the terms were only 1 year. And so they know this guy was there from 51 to 52 AD, so that's when Paul comes to Corinth. It's pretty cool. So now we're down to plus 21. But Paul says, I gave you what I was given. Here's the $1 million question. When and from whom did Paul receive this data? When and from whom did Paul receive this data? I don't have time to map this all out, and I worked on this in my dissertation, but I'm going to just tell you an easily reproducible way to get here. Let me tell you the critics' conclusion. I'm going to give you the consensus position of New Testament critics. The most common view is that this material was received by Paul at about plus 35 when he went up to Jerusalem for the first time. Now, remember my argument. Those texts are received as authentic Pauline texts. Paul would not knowingly lie. Honest guy, good scholar, careful. He's a former enemy, knows the eyewitnesses. He's just the right guy at the right place at the right time. And Paul does the math for us. How do you get 35? Let's do the math. Here's the cross. 30 AD. When did Paul come to Christ? Now, that's like asking you, how close is Acts 9 to Acts 1? And scholars put Paul's conversion at about, I just read a critic the other day who puts his conversion at plus 1. Now, 1 to 3 is typical. 1 to 3 years. Let's take an average. Let's say Paul meets Jesus on the road to Damascus at plus 2. In Galatians chapter 1, verse 16, right before the passage I'm going to use, Paul says, I didn't go running up to Jerusalem to meet these guys who were apostles before me. I went off and spent 3 years with the Lord, and then I went to Jerusalem. Okay, so he gives us the math. Cross, plus 2. 3 years later, he goes to Jerusalem. 2 plus 3, 5. Now, just to be funny, I'll go, oh, wait a minute, what? Oh, you think this is 33 AD? Okay, cool. And you think, what? Oh, you think Paul was converted 3 years later? Okay, cool. 3 plus 3, 6 years after the cross. It doesn't change anything. So 5 to 6 years after ground zero, Paul's in Jerusalem, Galatians 1:18, and he is spending 15 days with 2 apostles, James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter. He says, I didn't see any other apostle. He spent 15 days with them. Now, he doesn't tell us what we talked about. He will in a minute about his second visit, but he doesn't tell us what he talked about. However, let me give you some arguments for at least if he didn't bring the gospel up first and foremost, the gospel would definitely have been brought up in 15 days. And my arguments would be like this. Number one, This had just happened to Paul. It's foremost on his mind. Number two, this is what he was about. He said, I came to preach nothing but Christ and him crucified. So this is what Paul's about. Number three, he's with the disciples of the Lord. What would he more want to talk about? Number four, what's the theme of the book of Galatians? I'll give you the theme of Galatians in a sense. This is the gospel. Don't screw it up. Don't make it bigger. Don't make it less. Just get it right, preach it, that's it. So since this is the book of Galatians, what else could he have brought up except the gospel? So for those reasons, I think it's pretty clear in 15 days, over here, in 15 days, +5, maybe +6, but it might only have been +4 if he was converted at +1. Paul spends 2 weeks with them. I think, you know what? I know a question would be my first one for Peter and James, if I'm Paul. Here's my first question. Guys, I'll tell you what Jesus looked like on the way to Damascus if you tell me what he was like when you saw him after the cross. Let's change some information here. I want to hear your testimonies. I've heard some rumors, but I want to get it from the horse's mouth. I want you guys to tell me what's going on. And then Paul was kind of brash, right? Paul was pushy. Paul was, and I think I would add on Paul, I'd say, guys, I don't want to be offensive, but Peter, you're the chief apostle. You denied your Lord 3 times. I kind of like to know what was going on in your mind when you saw the Lord for the first time. James, not trying to be hard on you, but you're a family member. You thought your brother was nuts. That's what I hear. Tell me if I'm wrong. And I hear you came to become a Christian and the pastor of this church because you saw the risen Jesus. Is that true, guys? Because, you know, it must have been an amazing appearance when Jesus appeared to Peter. I love that song that was out in the mid-'80s. He's Alive, popular Christian song, where it's told from Peter's viewpoint. And Peter's mopey and he's depressed. And he says, even if you were alive, it wouldn't mean anything because I felt it. And then he says all the gates and doors were locked. And Jesus appeared. And the Peter who said it wouldn't make a bit of a difference, Peter goes, oh no. And the first time I ever saw this performed, it was on the Thomas Road platform. I say performed, it was a professor from the music department. And he fell down on his knees. Because the song says, I fell down on my knees and I clung to him and cried. And then what's the first thing Peter says? He's alive, I'm forgiven, heaven's gates are open wide. There's a direct argument from the resurrection of Jesus to the gospel to eternal life. So I said, I mean, that's where I'm going if I'm Paul. I'm going to say, what was it like? And James, what'd you think when you're in your room alone or whatever and Jesus appears to you and he goes, bro, it's me. I didn't make this up. By the way, the Greek says hands, and I used to get this question all the time. I don't get it so much anymore, probably because the shroud is, people have heard about this. The Greek says hands, but this is a time where the Greek is not very exact. Greek is often quite, 4 words for love and so on, but Greek says hand, but the word for hand, I was even told, you guys correct me, I was told there's no Greek word for wrist.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
Yeah, in fact, I was talking to a contemporary Greek lady who was in the crowd one time. She came up to me and said, I never thought about that. She goes, we don't have a word for Greek, but that's modern. I mean, we don't have a word for wrist, but that's modern. And one time in the Old Testament, the Septuagint, I'm told that the word for hand is used and it's the lower arm. So it's just not a very, so saying it was nails to the hand just doesn't solve the issue. And this would rip out. Almost all medical doctors think it wasn't put there. The shroud's got it here. That's where they believe they nailed it anyway. So that's why I do that when I put Jesus' hands out there. I tell them it's, I don't go to this explanation, but for your sake. Says, bro, you rejected me. It's me. I mean, James, what was that like? Now let me tell you guys what it was like for me. I was persecuting people, killing people. On the way to Damascus, I was struck down, etc. So I reenact a little bit of this. I'll say Paul came up there, does the math for you? Either +4, 5, or 6. So let's just say 5. Nice average. +5, Paul's here. And by the way, I don't ever write it out for him, but there's a Greek word in Galatians 1:18 one of you guys might want to do a word study on this for one of your papers. What's the word?
It's the word for history.
Hysteresi. The root word is histor. It's the Greek word for which we get our word history. But the translations usually slaughter it. Translations usually say, I saw Peter. I got acquainted with Peter. But I know of two non-evangelical word studies, detailed word studies. And they say the best way to translate this word is the first person eyewitness investigator. You know, you see it probably every night on the 11 o'clock news. Eyewitness news. We were there. We bring it to you first. Now I'm overdoing it. It's not quite that strong of a concept, but it does mean check it out. The word means I went and checked it out for myself. In fact, I read one time, I have to go back and look at this, but I read a long time ago that in early papyri, it's used once of a geographer who, instead of asking somebody what's up the river, he goes and checks it out for himself. Histor. So it doesn't mean history in the beginning, but it means to check it out. And Paul says he goes to Jerusalem, he's with the two apostles, right time, right place, right people. He's checking it out. What? Well, the whole theme of the book's the gospel. Besides, how could he? No critic is even going to say he could go 15 days and not discuss the gospel. So Paul's there. He's getting this material. We're at +5. But don't miss my point. This is when Paul received the material. Let's go back all the way to the cross. Paul gets it, presumably from Peter and James. Richard Bauckham. Habermas had been saying this for 15 years. Nobody believes it because Habermas says it. In Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, Bauckham says this is the consensus New Testament position that Paul received. We quote somebody who says this. He quotes him approvingly. That the consensus New Testament position is that they got this material +5. All right. Now, he received it at +5. That means they had it before he had it. Right? It's an early creed. And I don't explain that to people. I'll just say early creed means it's standardized, memorized language. And in the Greek, it's usually thought that there's two stanzas and it reads like this, da 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 da, that this creed reads in 2 sections. So it takes a while to standardize a creed. It's sort of like saying, I got words to a song, but now I need to hook up with somebody to get some notes. You know, it takes a little while to do that. So here's when Paul hears it. They had the testimony before he had it. It takes a little while to standardize this. Bingo, we're already at the cross. So you can do it this way, Paul working back, or you can do it this way and work up. When I first started doing this lecture, I was only able to say, doing minimal facts, I was only able to say it's 5, +5 approximately, and people had it before Paul. It took time to do the creed. Now, the latest scholars have hammered this stuff out, and they go all the way back to the cross. It's progressed. And I'll cite Larry Hurtado, Richard Bauckham, James D.G. Dunn. The 3 of them are the big 3 who do this. In fact, one of Dunn's books is dedicated to my other 2 comrades who researched this exact period, and the book's dedicated to Richard Bauckham and Larry Hurtado. It's pretty cool. And here's what they say. I'll tell the group. And I said this with Richard Bauckham sitting there. This is the part it wasn't going to contradict me. But they say, coming out of the gate in 30 or 33 AD, coming out of the gate at ground zero, you have to have 3 things present in order for Christianity to be preached. And those 3 things are high Christology. Now, how do you have a high Christology? According to Hurtado's argument, we went over this already, but Hurtado's argument, I do it for the people. Hurtado's argument is monotheistic culture and they're worshiping Jesus. That's a real no-no. But they were doing it. Explain it. That's Hurtado's argument. Worship Jesus in a monotheistic Jewish culture. Bauckham's, they took verses attributed to Jehovah and applied them to Jesus at a very early date. And the 3 best examples are usually said to be Romans 10:9, confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, believe in your heart God's raised from the dead. You say that's a creed, by the way. Everybody thinks it's a creed. And then Paul gives his 2 cents. The 2 cents is not part of the creed. But Paul gives his 2 cents by saying whoever calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved, quotes Joel, and is Jehovah. So Paul's at least telling you what he means by confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord. So, high Christology. By the way, you kind of have Hurtado and Bauckham there. You're praising the Lord and you're using the term for that's committed to Jehovah in Joel. So Romans 10:9 is a biggie. Philippians 2 is a biggie. Of course, don't make the mistake, if you're not a Greek guy, don't make the mistake of citing that thought of not robbery to be equal with God. That's not what the Greek says. That's King James, and that's one of the mistranslated places. But the part about Philippians 2 that is in the text is where the creed, you don't say Paul, it's pre-Pauline. Paul's reporting it, but it's not Paul's. Where the text says he's in the morphe of God. Next verse, he's in the morphe of a servant. Famous kenosis passage. Morphe, form, in English doesn't mean a lot, you know? Over there is a roughed-in house. We're going to be putting up the drywall today, and pretty soon we'll put a roof on it, and that's the form. But in Greek, it can mean other things, and there's a big debate about this. But the primary meaning of morphe has to do with essence. So the creed says, morphe of God, next verse, morphe of a servant. So Philippians 2 is a tough one. Not the thought of not robbery part, but the morphe contrast. So Romans 10, Philippians 2, and one that I never used until just recently, because these guys take it so seriously. 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Let me read it to you. If you've got into this, it's a hot topic today, but people seem to think it pushes you where a lot of people don't want to go because it's so sacred. 1 Corinthians 6:8, another creed.
You mean 8:6?
8:6? Sorry about that. Yeah. 8:6. Yet for us there is but one God the Father, from whom all things came, and for whom we know, which is an adaptation of the Shema, right, in the Old Testament. That first part. 8:6a is an adaptation of the Shema. For us, there's but one God, the Father, from whom all things come, and in whom we live. And there is but one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things come, and through whom we live. Now the question is, either way, it's got astounding consequences. I do not tell the people to pew this. But either way, either Paul has brought Jesus into the Shema, which is like, there's nothing more blasphemous you could do in the Old Testament than to add Jesus to the Hear, O Israel, Lord your God is one. He's either brought Jesus into the Shema, or he's got the Shema and he's snugging Jesus right up to it. Either way, this is revolutionary. It'd be more revolutionary if he was putting Jesus into the Shema. But I mean, the lesser view is that he's snugging Jesus right up against the Shema. This is heavy stuff, you know.
Especially considering he's a Pharisee.
Pardon?
Especially considering he's a Pharisee.
Yeah. And this is early. This is that, you know, early. This is a creed. So they're running around with this stuff like in the 30s AD. So this is revolutionary. And if I throw one more in, those three really get them. But if you want a fourth one, Romans 1, 3, and 4, another creed. Jesus showed himself to be Lord, Son of God, and Messiah by virtue of his resurrection from the dead. A lot of guys, almost everybody says it's a creed, but that includes Barterman. So, all right, so there's two ways to get here. One is Paul got it, they had it, takes a while to formalize it, we're all the way back to the cross. That's one way to check this. The other way is to check it this way. What would you need out of the gate to preach Christianity? And the three scholars who are as influential, more influential than anybody on this early period right here, Hurtado, Bauckham, done, and they all say, coming out of the gate, you have to have a high Christology, you have to have a death, and you have to have a resurrection. In other words, they don't say it this way. They just say you have to have that coming out of the gates. But my way I would download is to say, bingo, you got the gospel. Coming out of the gates, you had to have the gospel. Now let me tell you why this is significant. I had lunch with James D.G. Dunn. We were together for a series of debates way back in 1985 or 6. And he told me, I asked him what he thought about the deity of Christ, and he took the view that a lot of critical scholars took. He took the view that that Jesus may have been deity all along, but it took the New Testament a while to unpack these revolutionary things. And it may have taken them all the way down to the Gospel of John to unpack the John 1:1, John 20:28, John 1:18 type high Christology. His view was that you start unpacking it all along the New Testament, but you really get it in John. And Raymond Brown, probably the foremost American New Testament scholar before he died, Raymond Brown said a very influential statement. If Jesus would have returned about 95 AD and read the Gospel of John, Jesus probably would have said, yeah, I think he's got it right. That's where I was going. In other words, it took Jesus a while to realize this himself. Because being fully human means you don't get it zapped into you. Now, that's not a super orthodox view, but it's a common view that says he could have been deity all the way back then, but it would even have taken it a while for it to register for Jesus. Well, Dunn has not, he told me this over lunch, that he thinks that the church was fully unpacking it down here. Now he's changed his view, and he thinks you had to have had the essentials coming out of the gate down here. Isn't that something? These guys have changed their position from unpacking it down there to having it here. And it's from Hurtado, worshipped, Bauckham, applying Jehovah and like phrases to Jesus at a very early day.
Have you read J.N.D. Kelly's Early Christian
Pardon?
Doctrines? Have you read J.N.D. Kelly's Early Christian Doctrines?
I used it for a text once.
Yeah, because that's one of his theses as well.
It's been a long time. It's been 30 years since I've looked at Kelly. Does he say coming out of the gate you got that down there?
He said you have to have it or else you wouldn't have Christianity.
This is his doctrine book?
Early Christian Doctrines, correct.
Early Christian Doctrines. This is on creeds. It's one of the best creed books. So to me, you have a check and balance. Paul got it. They gave it to him. Takes a while to formalize it. Bingo, you're at the cross. Or you got these guys going, Christianity wouldn't even have gotten off the ground without a distinctive message. And the most distinctive message is high Christology. He died. That's not a big thing. Everyone dies. But died for your sins and was raised from the dead. And so Bart Ehrman now says this material goes back to the one dude. Probably 10 times in his book, Bart Ehrman says this goes back to the 30s. Twice he says it goes back within a year or two of the cross. So, now I added things for you guys, but you can see it's a very simple argument. If you want to do the argument itself, all you need for like 6th graders, 30 AD, 1 Corinthians 15 is written, that this is when Paul was there and preached it, this is when Paul heard it from these guys, we're all the way back to the cross. You don't have to use guys' names like Hurtado and Bauckham and Dunn, but they had to have something distinctive to teach, and scholars today agree that due to worship and applying God's name in the Old Testament to Jesus in the New Testament, we have a high Christology, preaching resurrection right from the beginning, and I would use this even with 6th graders, even Bart Ehrman, probably the best-known skeptic in America, accredited skeptic in America, says this message goes all the way back to the cross. So what do you get from this? You get the 2 E's, early and eyewitness. And that's why critics take this material strongly and can't gainsay it. Just right there, it's everything we need. All right, now past our normal, well, not really, it's just about break time here. You want to just think about this? You want to go get some coffee and we can ask for any questions right after the break? Is that the way to do it? I've got about a half dozen other points of evidence to go over with you.
Yep.
And basically, we're getting pretty close to the end here.
So Balcom, it's Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, it's in that text?
In that book, I can get your page number, but in Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, he quotes a guy approvingly and says the consensus New Testament position is that Paul received the 1 Corinthians 15 material at 35 AD when he visited Peter and James in Jerusalem. That's a consensus New Testament position. Now, you know what? I don't tell the church group this, but I out-skeptic the skeptics. Someone's going to say, it's amazing that they don't say this. But if I were a skeptic, I'd go, well, just because he's got the material in 55, I'll grant that. Just because he preached it in 51, the creedal material, okay, I understand that. And I will grant that he had to discuss the gospel with the two guys. I'll grant that. But that doesn't mean he got the creedal material then. He could have just discussed the gospel and got the creed in 48 AD. Well, first of all, that's still early eyewitness. And secondly, I tell people, bottom line, seriously, I don't care when and where he got the creed. I want to know when and where he got the material on which the creed is based. And that simply means they discuss the gospel. It's not hard. So if he didn't get the creed, he got the material on which the creed is based. By the way, I did this whole thing, and I forgot to tell you the last step. We'll just join it this morning. This is 35 AD. Remember, there's no break between Galatians 1 and Galatians 2. As Galatians 2 opens, Paul says 14 years later, I went back to Jerusalem. Critics put this at about 48 or plus 18. And he says specifically this time, which I think makes it all the more likely, it's a fifth argument for how do you know he did the gospel in James 1. In James 2, Galatians 2:2, he says, I like the King James here, but translations are very similar. I went back up to Jerusalem, talked to the apostles again, and I set before them the gospel I was preaching to see if I was running or had run in vain. I think it's one of the oddest, but one of the most significant verses in the New Testament. It's odd because at plus 18, I went back up there to set before them the gospel I was preaching, make sure we're all on the same page. And then in the church setting, I raised this objection. I go, Paul, you waited 18 years to check it out? I think Paul would say, you know something? I don't like it when people really don't listen to my argument. Let's do this again. Because he just allows me to repeat it again, right? Let's do it again. Paul would say, no, it's not the first time I went up there at plus 18. Here's the cross. I got it from Jesus. You got a better source? Yeah, I didn't think so. Then I went up there at plus 5 and checked it out. This is at least the third time I've checked out the message. With Jesus, with Peter and James, and now I come up again. So instead of saying this is the first time he checks it out, it makes Paul look like a great researcher, because this is like the third time he's going through this. Paul just really wants this to be tight. 2:2. Galatians 2:2. Guys, let's do it again. It's the gospel I'm preaching. I'm taking the Gentiles, you're doing the Jews. Are we on the same page? I think it's Galatians 2:6. 5 words in English. Beautiful words. They added nothing to me.
Preach it. They
added nothing to me. Yes, we're all on the same page. In fact, in verses 9 and 10, this is where we get our teaching. He says Paul says they laid the right hand of fellowship on Barnabas and me and sent us out, us to the Gentiles and Peter to the Jews. But the point is, the message was the same. That's incredible. Because this is them telling Paul, yes, we're all on the same page. 1 Corinthians 15:11, right after the creed. 1 Corinthians 15:11, Paul's talking about them seeing the risen Jesus. Remember the appearances to Peter and the 12 and all the apostles and the 500. And then he says, whether it's them or me, so we preach and so you believe. That's Paul saying, see, they said Paul was teaching the same thing. Now Paul's saying they're teaching the same thing. We have a check and balances. This is so cool because it's just like this. It's just woven together. So Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:11, I really don't care if you go to them. or if you go to me, you're going to hear the same message. So we preach and so you believe. So we preach. And that's why in verses 12, 13, and 15, that's why I keep saying, if Christ has not been raised, then our message is not true. We have preached in vain. The we there is he and the apostles, which seems like a real simple. On one level, you can go, well, yeah, duh, they were all preaching it. But on the other hand, get the significance of what he's saying. To say we, he's saying, I checked this out, and we're all on the same page. It's the same gospel. Because it goes back to 1 Corinthians 15:11. Whether it's I or they, so we preach and so you believe. This is so cool because it's simple, but the argument just goes together like this, and how do you unravel it? Now, you can say it was a hallucination. You can say, you can't say they were lying. That doesn't work here. That's why the fraud is so stupid. You could say, Jesus, you could say swoon. Nobody goes there, but you could say swoon. Can't say legend anymore. Remember I said yesterday this is the best argument against legend? This is the best argument against copycat? Maybe they did hear somebody say copycat and it got them going, but that's not the argument. You have to deal with where they got this and how they traced the eyewitnesses and who saw it. This is by far, even if they heard it and got the germ of an idea, you have to account for the origination of this preaching and people who say, I saw, and then they're willing to die for it. That's the centrality. And that's why Mettinger, and even back to Fleeterer, who holds the old history of religion view, which is close to internet infidels today, even though he held that, he in 1905 and Mettinger like 2003, that's why these guys say, yes, there are teachings like this before Christ, but it doesn't touch resurrection. This is why. And Fleeter even, 05, specifically says, the reason it doesn't touch Jesus' resurrection, because Jesus' resurrection is specifically based on experiences, not on stories in other cultures. In other words, language of sight. Language of sight. That's why that's such a strong argument. They could be wrong about it, but you have to deal with the language of sight, because that's where all the arguments go. Not, I heard a good story, but I saw. I mean, to me, for a miracle message, it's a miracle 2,000 years ago. Try to think of a tighter argument than this. But it's so simple. You can give it to anybody. 55, 51, 35, 30. 4 key dates. A few key guys. Oh, don't forget in Galatians 2 when he goes back, Peter's still there. James is still there. John is there. You got the big 4. Nobody's more influential in early church history. But the big 4 are there, all agreeing as to they added nothing to me, all agreeing as to the content of the gospel message, the big 4. And we have reports of the martyrdom of 3 of them, they're in your notes, 3 of them in the 1st century, Peter, Paul, and James. And you got the report that John was martyred as a 2nd century source, is still early. All right, I want to ask if there's any questions. I'll let you go to the bathroom and get your coffee, and I'll start right after break by asking if you've got any questions. Now, you guys realize I stopped and did things. Hysteresis, the 3 texts, shama. I don't do that stuff so much in churches. You could add it. I think you could add it. But the basic lecture here, you can see how you could do it for elementary kids. You have to be patient. You have to repeat it with them. You have to use little words. You don't throw scholars' names in there. But you can give them the message. And I think, if you quizzed them on it, if you were the teacher. I hear teachers saying, I gave it to my class. I used it in my Sunday school class. I did it in my Christian high school. And get this down. Now let's say they get to school and someone hammers them on evolution. Or someone hammers them on some other topic. Or I'll bet you God doesn't talk to you. Bet you doesn't answer your prayers today. I mean, the hammering could come from any direction. But teach the kids not only this argument, but teach them as long as the gospel is true, Christianity follows. We need nothing else for Christianity. Now, please understand the context of I'm saying this. I'm not saying no other doctrine is important. That's silly. I'm just saying, if all you know is that Jesus was the Son of God who died on the cross for my sins and was raised from the dead, Christianity follows, and you can ask all the rest of your questions in heaven. So if someone hits you on periphery spots, I would teach my young people this. Critics will almost always hit you on periphery spots. Now, they might go after resurrection, they might say copycat. But this does not explain copycat. It doesn't answer. And this is why almost nobody today holds the legend theory. Because even if it was what happened, it doesn't explain this aspect of it. So even if it's right, it's wrong. All right, let's take a break, come back, ask if you have any questions. We've got some other evidences, and we are moving inexorably to our big conclusion, which is don't be late with your papers. All right.
One question: how are the Red Wings going to do this year?
I'm not a Red Wings fan.
I thought you were a Detroit Red Wings fan.
They're my second favorite team. Blackhawks.
Oh, how are the Blackhawks?
Best team in hockey right now, easily. They haven't lost a game yet in regulation.
Going all the way?
Hope so. I'm not going to be that cocky. Because in hockey, the best team doesn't usually win. It's whoever's hot in the playoffs.
Same with football.